Hi, Jim here, and you're listening to the Honest Filmmaker podcast, career advice from people in the business. This week, I spoke to filmmaker Benn Wiebe. Ben has produced entertainment news for the US and China, but now works on social impact driven projects. He wants to make a difference, from being embedded with humanitarian rangers in Iraq to producing South by Southwest winning and Oscar shortlisted documentaries. I talked to Ben about how he wants to make the industry healthier for everybody, what it's like being on set if you've got mental health issues, and also how to make and promote social impact documentaries. Enjoy. So, I'm pitching myself as the honest filmmaker, but looking at your bio, it feels like you're the ethical filmmaker because of all the stuff you're involved in. And we'll come to those
Sure.
later on. But just to start with, how did you get into the industry? Did you go to uni? What was your sort of career path in?
I did go to uni. Yeah, I actually was at the University of Oregon for a while, and was studying psychology and journalism. But I always knew I wanted to work in film, and you know how that happens when you don't you don't necessarily have a lot of people around you encouraging you, into the industry or know people that work in the industry, and so I didn't. Um, and so finally I realized that about halfway through college I was just kind of directionless, right? And I finally made the decision to switch to film school. So then I went to the Art Institute, um, and yeah, and then mostly instructors there were people who had really worked on shows and had been in the industry, and so I had several of them encouraging me. If I got an opportunity to work on a movie or a TV show, take it, take that chance and run with it. You really have to. And I did. I got an opportunity about 2 years into film school, to just intern on a movie called Follow the Prophet with Diane Venora and Tom Noonan and folks like that in the cast. And so yeah, so I took it, and from there, you just start meeting people, and they see you working hard and just being eager to learn, right? And then I got invited to work on a film from there, and and then off the second one, got invited to work on a third film, and that third film was a Jennifer Aniston movie, and that's when I started to really, catch a good
Mhm.
wave, and then you start feeling like I'm a professional now. I feel like I'm,
I'm in the
you
business.
know, I'm in this. Yeah, yeah. So, but yeah, I mean, that's how it started.
And what if you could go back in time now and say something to younger you who first started that journey, what would you say to that person, or what advice would you give them?
I would definitely give advice around just being a curious person, and going into it with the spirit of being a good steward for other people, especially in production. I worked in the production department, so that specific department is really about how do we help everybody else? How do we make sure everyone has what they need, that the teams are hired appropriately, right? Like staffed to what we need, and then just making sure we can keep things on time and on schedule. So I think coming from that perspective too, um, I think if you can come at it from this spirit of stewardship, that you're there to take care of others and
Mm.
to make sure that this freight train, that is making movies, is able to get through it. Because I've never been on a project where people weren't burnt out by the end, right, and ready for a break. Because it is like a freight train when you hit production, and there's no stopping it, right? So that really does require having good folks around who are making sure, looking out for people's well-being and mental health, and
Mm.
and and just making sure we can focus and have good morale. That's not something that I was really aware of from the beginning, and I'm a huge advocate now,
Mm.
for that.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, I will come to that sort of section of the work you do, and I completely agree that those any sort of creative endeavor is always stressful. So there's obviously a lot of things impacting in those environments. Just to continue on that journey you've been on in your career, what was day one like on the big Jennifer Aniston thing? What is that you sort of keeping under control the fact that wow, this like you say, it's a huge production and I'm just part of it, or how did you deal with that?
Yeah, so it was like a $10 million, rom-com type film, And I would say this from the beginning, everyone was prepared by the producers that for when Jennifer Aniston showed up, for everyone to just, not talk to her, right? Everyone just be super professional, which doesn't necessarily set up an environment for people to be relaxed, trusted to do their job, right? It's, oh, we should be paranoid that the star of the project, is going to be someone who we have to walk on eggshells around,
Mm.
right? And so that environment was definitely set up when it didn't need to be,
Mm.
right? When she came in, because I had never been around, kind of A-list level folks, so all is what you've heard, and what you hear is, oh, there will be a big team of people around them. We need to make sure everything's smooth. There's no balls dropped. When she came in, she didn't have a team with her, right? It was a super not, and the project itself, was actually very smooth.
Mm.
And naturally, for a comedy, there was actually a lot of laughter and decent morale on the set, which can go with the content.
Mm.
So it is fun working on comedies. But I would say that the expectations set by the people in leadership was completely the opposite of what happened. And if they had just actually instilled trust in all of us, even people like me who are still fairly new, at being on sets, uh, I think it would have been even better, right?
Mm.
Because otherwise, you end up with people who are just kind of paranoid, and then they think they can't, you can't just be yourself. You can't just relax and work hard at the same time.
Mm.
And so, yeah, I mean that was my first, thing I really noticed was people just setting up an environment that didn't need to be as strict and as kind of hardcore disciplined
Mm.
when no balls had been dropped,
Yeah.
right, up to that point.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, that was definitely my biggest takeaway. But that was a really good. That was still one of my favorite things I worked on because it was pretty smooth, uh, and because of the content, because of the comedy narrative, it did create a nice vibe on set where there was more laughter and people actually had fun reading the script as we would continue to update it,
Mm.
right, um, and all that. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Good. That's a good advice. And also, I guess if you're starting your own production, if you're a student, even if you're doing your graduation piece, you've got to remember that whatever level of stress you're at, if that kind of cascades down to everybody on the set, that vibe. So if you get that wrong at the beginning, like you say, you can put everybody on edge and not enjoy the experience as much.
Exactly. Yeah, it just sets the tone of permission from the beginning.
Mm.
Yeah.
So I've seen on your credit list you've got impact producer comes up a lot. So could you explain what an impact producer is and does?
Yeah, absolutely. So impact producing is it's how do we take a film, or a show and figure out how it can influence and impact social movement, right? So and that project does not have to be, say, ideologically activist on its face, right? It doesn't have to be a David Attenborough documentary, for example, right? It could be a fiction piece or something that could easily be said to be lighthearted entertainment. But I think in any story it has a place to influence something that's relevant in the public discourse, right? And I mean that's what stories are all about. It's
Mm.
something we can relate to and resonate and talk about. And so with impact producing, a lot of it is geared towards how do we use them as tools, education tools, political tools, right? How do we get films and shows in front of people who write policy or push advocacy on certain issues? I mean, there was a movie recently called The Territory that ended up being very influential on like EU Parliament discussions on deforestation,
Mm.
right? Or Mark Ruffalo did a film called Dark Waters, which was a fiction film, but it was based on true story of a real situation.
Mm.
And that movie was also very useful in policy discussions around what they call forever chemicals, that end up in like bodies of water. So, so those are examples. And impact producing is still at a fairly young age, I think, where
Mm.
it's becoming more supported, right? More projects are starting to hire people to do this. And it's now at a stage where we're really trying to quantify what success looks like, right? Does it mean we're able to help the movie make more money or extend its shelf life for popularity, right? And be relevant in the public discourse? Or does it mean that it's actually having a direct influence on some kind of social movement,
Mm.
right? And then that's all being explored as.
And do you do when you take on a role like that, are you on it from the very start, or is it something that you do most of your work in post-production and when you're kind of releasing the film?
So the battle right now is to get it included from the beginning,
Mm.
right? Just like any other leads would be. A lot of it has been relegated towards the back end, right? When you're talking about distro and where's it going to go and how long is it going to be trending,
Mm.
wherever it is, right? And even within that, I mean, I've done impact producing for some Netflix original titles, for example, and even then, it was hard to push them. After a certain amount of time had passed that the film had been out, it was hard to push them to say, "Hey, could we also, take the film here and get some of the main key participants from the film to participate in these discussions, even with EU Parliament type discussions,
Mm.
which we've been able to arrange." And it was tough because after a certain amount of time, like any studio, they'll say, "Well, we're already moving on to other titles. We're not focused on that one anymore." You know what I mean? So there is that battle going on of, how studios or any production is prioritizing this role, what they really want to get out of it. So a lot of people say, "Oh, it's great that we can create extra awareness,"
Mm.
but a lot of impact producing is really about how do we get beyond that? How do we actually take this film and make it something useful beyond awareness around engagement, movement, right? And the apex is influencing policy and advocacy. Like
Mm.
that's the ultimate, ambition, I would say.
Yeah. And if you're again, you might come out of uni, or you might do it as your final project. You might decide to do a film about something you're really passionate about that you think needs to change. If you've made that super micro budget documentary, say you've picked a subject, you've made an important film to yourself, what's your advice to reaching those audiences, or what would you do with it?
I mean, I think the best thing now is that there are so many more options to seek distribution, right? So yeah, so it doesn't really. I don't ever want filmmakers to focus on, oh well, my film has a very low budget, so maybe some of the big folks won't be interested. That's not the case at all, right? You never know who's going to be interested, and it's really about how you can show that your story will resonate with people and what kinds of people and
Mm.
where those people are, right? So whether it's streamers or a cinematic release, or if you think it can go an education route, and things like that, right, where they use it in universities, for example, all over the place, or it gets programmed into events. There's a lot more live events now that want to program movies and short form type stuff into their programming. And those are places too that can also get you access to getting a bigger distribution deal. For example, the Hollywood Climate Summit, where I've been able to be an advisor previously on. That's held in Los Angeles, and it now has Netflix and Paramount, and other folks at that level as sponsors and
Mm.
supporters. And there was a film called Youth versus Gov that showcased at that event, and it didn't have any major distribution, but because and Netflix wasn't the ones who programmed it into the event, right? But because Netflix was involved with that event, some of them folks saw it and they picked it up.
Mm.
So there's a lot more avenues for people to really explore, and there are a lot more streamers too available. And one of the best things, whether you like the model or not of streaming, one of the benefits to people who don't have access to, a ton of resources and big money to make films, is streamers are always at the mercy of needing high volume in order to function. They
Mm.
need a lot of films, which means they are constantly looking and they are procuring more projects than traditional studio reps are, which is good for filmmakers, right?
Mm.
Because it means that if you've got something to bring to them and you find the right person, you get to the right person, there's a shot, there's at least a better shot that they're going to take a more serious look at it versus you send it to some sales and there's no guarantee they're going to look at it at all,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Because their volume is just much lower. So yeah, I feel like it is an encouraging time because I think there is less pressure on needing to hit a certain budget point
Mhm.
in order to have options for distribution.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and also, so moving on to mental health. So you're going to have to guide me through terminology here because this is not an
Yeah.
expert subject for me. So you've said yourself, you've got several mental health conditions. I don't know if I'd even use the word conditions, if that's the right way to describe them.
That's fine.
That's fine. So can you tell me about those things you have, if you don't mind?
Yeah. So I have what's called complex PTSD, which is a more long-term form of post-traumatic stress syndrome, and it's brought on by uh, regular PTSD is usually based around singular events that people experience, and
Mhm.
complex PTSD is more long term because it's based on trends, right, that have either gone on over years or there or multiple things that a person has experienced, and then it starts to really just impact your overall neurology. And there's similarities there to borderline personality disorder. There's a lot of crossover, and a lot of people can have both.
Mhm.
Um, there's also interesting debate, within the psychotherapy, community, right, on some of these diagnoses. But yeah, I mean, it makes it interesting in terms of our industry because uh, the entertainment industry overall functions very much on packaging hopes and dreams to people,
Mm.
which in turn is, there's some good in that, right? It keeps people, motivated even if when things aren't working out, right? But at the same time, it's easy to exploit people with that, right? And so it has been hard, having neurological conditions like this because it's really centered around experiencing trauma.
Mm.
So it's what you might call acquired neurodivergency
Yeah.
because it's not necessarily something you were born with; it's something you acquired. So yeah, and I mean, one of my primary abusers is in prison for many years, for example, right? So, but I think that all, it influences the way we see the world and the things we bring to the table. And it's also something that has given me a lot more compassion and helped me as a leader, when you lead through empathy, right?
Mm.
Versus, being a micromanager or being someone who leads through fear.
Yeah.
I don't believe leading with fear gets the best out of anyone.
Yeah.
Maybe once in a while it works, but so yeah, I see it as an asset. I don't see my conditions as something that makes art, but uh, and I like being transparent about it
Mm.
because you know any workforce doesn't matter what industry you work on can be very intolerant or you're made to feel that it's an intolerant environment for people to be open about their vulnerabilities.
Mm.
But the way people describe working on films is we're all in the trenches together. We're all going to get dirty and make this crazy project and we're all going to be exhausted at the end, but it's going to be great. And that only works if you really believe that there's a bond forming between you and those folks that you're in those trenches with. So that's why I like being transparent about saying, like, this is kind of how I function. This is how my brain works. Maybe it's a little less linear than other folks. But then it helps other people understand me. And then I welcome them to share the same, about themselves. And then they feel like there's a safe space forming. We don't need brick walls and pretend we're all just, robots with no baggage or no, you know, flaws or cracks or whatever you want
Yes.
to call
um, so talking about something like PTSD, how do you manage that? Because obviously film is this kind of, and the other ADD, film's like a quite a chaotic, stressful environment. Have you got sort of strategies you put in place to help you deal with it?
Yeah, they don't always work.
Mhm.
But yeah, I mean, because I also am someone who has ADD as well, and I had that from the very beginning. So uh, you do have to, become very conditioned about taking notes and getting yourself to a place where you can complete tasks, right? It becomes easier to start things. And it's not like that's unique to having these conditions.
Mm.
Starting things is easier than finishing things. I think a lot of us know what that's like. Um, but when it comes to making movies, as we've alluded to already, when it becomes like a freight train, there is a million things going on and they're happening quickly. And there's these tight deadlines that for the most part are not going to change. Like everything has to be done, by this certain time. And so if your brain is getting easily overwhelmed, right, with taking on, a huge list of things, or there's lots of people running around saying, I need this, I need that, right, because those are the film environments, then yeah, I mean, the onus does really become, onto yourself to make sure you're giving yourself healthy outlets to relax your brain, to make sure you're taking diligent notes right where you can. And I also take medication. That is it's serotonin based medication, and serotonin is what relaxes your brain,
Mhm.
so it keeps you from getting too much anxiety, right, and too flustered when things get chaotic,
Yeah.
especially at work. So, but I think in the end too, this is why we need community. My whole thing that I talk about a lot about people not being brick walls is I think it's super important. That's not just for people managing positions, right? It's true for everyone. If people can't feel comfortable enough to be a little bit vulnerable, and share some of these things in the workspace, then we're never going to create environments at work where there's real trust,
Mhm.
you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
And we have to be willing to admit, like, if someone feels like they're having the kind of day where they're like, I'm not 100% today, you know, right? Like, I think people need to be able to admit that if they're somehow not having a day where they're 100%, not just so that everyone can pick up their slack, but so that there's just open communication.
Mhm.
Because otherwise, people just start pretending that nothing's wrong. And then you get into that position where if you did miss something, you don't want to tell anyone
Mhm.
because there's been no establishment of any of that trust,
Yeah.
right? Or it's okay to show any vulnerability. That's when it gets hard, and then that's when things get missed because there's no incentive to actually share if there's a problem.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'd say it starts even, especially in this country, at school. You get judged, you get tested on absolutely everything, and you get like our daughter's school report's got 100%. You've got to put 100% effort in all the time, which is just not going to work, is it? Some days you do have a
Right.
bad day and you're not 100%. And on a film set, and in any business, I think a lot of these barriers get put up by ego. So people have certain positions that they think demands certain behaviors that can then make people feel terrible. So that would be my experience of it. Talking about set, sort of on set, keeping sets healthy, keeping everyone safe. So I noticed on your bio you talked about the I Am Sarah campaign, which relates to a crew member that was killed on set due to unsafe filming conditions. Um, what would you say? What would you say the main takeaways from that? And could you apply them, do you think, to sort of student films, micro budget productions?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, for people who aren't familiar with that scenario, there was a film in Atlanta, Georgia, in the U.S., where a camera assistant was hit by a train and killed. And and then it was one of the biggest cases for a film set because the main producer was found guilty of homicide, right? And I think that's possibly the first time that's ever happened. Even though there have been incidences where dangerous things have happened and people have even died on sets before, but to actually hold people on crews and producers accountable, right, seemed a very rare thing. So I think this definitely is relevant for people in film school all the way up, because there's always been, and the recent situation with the Alec Baldwin film, right, which is that's a case going on right now, right, and someone died, is who holds the responsibility. And so much of those conversations are, oh, it's everyone starts finger pointing, oh well, that was your job, right? So for the Sarah Jones situation, right, that happened all over the place. People are finger pointing, oh, it was the first assistant director, they're in charge of safety. Well, the director is really the that they should be. Well, what about the actual safety person? Is there an actual safety person? What about the location person who should have known that they're you know what I mean? And the answer is it's all of them.
Yeah.
Right? Everyone in any kind of leadership position, it has a responsibility, and also to convene together and agree, like have a consensus that there is an agreement, that there is the safety measures and all of that, right, have been taking place. And in these scenarios, like none of that happened, right? Which is also why you have the finger pointing. There clearly was no team consensus and people making sure all of the leads were being responsible. But the other one that gets conflated is people can play multiple roles on a set. And I think that's unique in this industry compared to a lot of others is, you can have a director who's also an actor who also happens to be one of the owners of the production company, right? And so then you say, oh, well, they're the director. They're not really responsible for safety. It's like, yeah, but they're also one of the producers, and producers are absolutely responsible for that. It's their movie, and especially if they're an owner of the production company. That's the Alec Baldwin situation actually happening right now, right? He was an actor in the film, but he's also a producer that has ownership of the film. So you can say on one hand, oh, the actor role of you doesn't have that responsibility, but you have multiple roles, and that's not an uncommon thing. So people going through film school, I think, really need to understand, have a really good understanding of what people's roles and responsibilities are, and also understand that if you have multiple roles, and the smaller the film, the more people have multiple roles, right? You can't afford to have 100 people staff. Big films have. So yeah, so people have multiple hats, and you need to make sure you have agreement of, especially when it comes down to taking care of the well-being of the people there, that there's, just like any company, it might be a part-time thing because it's a singular project, and that might be a few weeks or a few months, but you have a full responsibility to everyone to make sure that you're taking all those measures. And in some film schools, though, they even teach filmmakers to, oh, well, you don't have money, you don't have money for rent and all that, well, do guerrilla filmmaking. That's fine. Cheat and get the shot. I think that's terrible. Like, there are times where you can cheat and get the shot, and there's not really a safety concern in doing that. But if you just blanketly teach people that that's okay, then they're not going to know anything else. They're going to think, oh, if we can do it, we should always look for ways to cut corners. That's filmmaking. We should look ways to save money. We should make ways to do it faster. But what ends up coming in last, in that scenario, it's health and well-being and safety.
Yeah. Right. And a lot of the time it's the silly little things that can end up causing a big problem. So even I know a lot of students I work with now, they do like a mini risk assessment before they're even allowed to get the equipment out, which is a really good way of just writing down things that could potentially go wrong so they can deal with them and know who's responsible on set for that particular issue. But I know what you mean, that guerrilla style, and it's easy to get carried away when you're doing that. It's easy to think, oh, it'll be fine, and especially if it's a very small crew. So talking of sort of social impact films, again, talking about maybe a student who's found a subject they're really interested in, and some of the stuff you've been involved with, you've you've got a responsibility to the people you're making the film about. So could you talk about that a little bit, about how you balance a piece of sort of creative content with looking after the people who you're actually doing it about?
Yeah, no, great question. So, especially in, I mean, this can happen in fiction and nonfiction, right? Because you can have fiction stories that are still about real people. And so then the conversation there is, well, we might be taking liberties with the story. And I think it's always better than not to at least get some consent, even if it's not full consensus, but get some consent from the people that you're doing the story about. Because there are lots of movies where you hear about the real people saying, they didn't even, there wasn't even a conversation. I didn't even know this was happening, and I don't even like how the movie turned out.
Yeah.
You know, and so I think in every case, I think there is a responsibility to at least include people that you're doing the story about, right, in the process, in some way. Um, and I think that's less about getting their blessing as it is a sign of respect.
Mm.
And also, how can you really do a story justice authentically, right? If it's about real people and real situations, if you're not including the real people.
Yeah.
So in documentaries, that's a little bit less of a concern because you have to include that. It's, you're not hiring actors for the most part. You're dealing with the real people. And so I think there, the concern is more about giving yourself ample time if you do have good direct access to the people, because sometimes access is, I mean, for documentaries, access is your biggest asset,
Mm-hmm.
right? Do you have access to the people and the places and the events that you need? But when you have access to the people, making sure that before you start filming with them, that you've given yourself ample time to establish trust with them, because that's the biggest thing that's going to pay off, and that's how you're going to open them up to getting the real gritty, you know, stuff, right? And the things that they haven't possibly shared with anyone else.
Mm.
And that's what makes your movie golden. I mean, not just from a commercial point of view, which is great in a commercial point of view, because for any people trying to figure out how to pitch a film, especially for a documentary, what you need to be able to say is there's an exclusive element here. Either this story hasn't been shared or this person really hasn't been documented in this way before. So these are exclusives.
Mm.
I've established trust these people, and they're willing to share it with me, with our team, right? And so that's the power of documentary. But that only can happen if you're serious about establishing trust. Because some people, not everyone, but some people can be very good at smoking you out if they feel like you're just there to kind of exploit their story and just make
Mm.
another project for yourself, right? And so that definitely needs to be taken seriously. And I don't think in film schools that's another area, for example, where they're really taught, people are really taught that element of what it takes to establish trust,
Mm.
or what it takes, or how far you can push a subject. I've been, I've worked on some documentaries where, like, we were trying to get a father to admit very honest thing about his kid, as in his kid was in a dire situation, right? He needed help from the people around him, and the father wouldn't break at all.
Mm.
Just and what all we wanted was raw honesty. It took 5 hours under a hot mic and a hot light, right, for him to finally break. And some people on the crew thought it was bad that we
Mm.
were being abusive to him as a subject. And I was like, no, he needs to be broken down emotionally so that he stops worrying about the camera being there and us pushing him. And he just starts giving us what he's really feeling. The
Mm.
raw emotions of what he's really feeling. And then you kind of get that veil to go away and that wall to kind of crumble down a little bit. That's what it's about.
Yeah.
And that takes, practice and real understanding to
Yeah.
figure it out.
And also the audience watching, if you don't get to that point, it's very unsatisfying for them, because they don't get that. People
Yeah.
can sniff that out, can't they, if they're not getting the full story, or they're
Yeah.
not getting the truth.
Yeah. And there's no catharsis.
I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. If you want more advice from industry professionals who are out there at the moment working, or you just want to listen to some cool stories from film sets from around the world, then please do subscribe.